On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we sit down with Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein.
Putting another Clinton in the White House, that's not the solution. That was the problem, and it's only going to fan the flames of right-wing extremism. As Bernie Sanders himself said, many times, the solution to this kind of crisis, and it's real pain that the Trump supporters are responding to, the solution is truly progressive and transformative, just economic, revolutionary policies, and that's what my campaign brings to the table.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not socialism, obedience, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt en masse. On Contact with Chris Hedges. We are entering a dangerous moment when few people, no matter what their political orientation, trust the power elite. The rise of right-wing populism with dark undertones of fascism looks set in the next presidential election, as it does in parts of Europe, to pit itself against the dying gasps of the corporate establishment. Our escape route is narrow and diminishing. Playing the old political game, attempting tepid reform by remaining within the two-party system won't work. Donald Trump is responding to a global phenomenon by an enraged and dispossessed working class. He is not the phenomenon. If we on the left do not challenge the centers of power, including the Democratic Party, then by default, this tide of anger and despair will be funneled into a frightening proto-fascism. Anya Parampil looks back at how third parties have traditionally renewed the political vibrancy of American society.
Loyalists to the Democratic and Republican parties often repeat the line that no third party has ever truly organized in the United States. But a quick glance at history renders that talking point a myth. Take, for example, the election in 1992, when billionaire Ross Perot ran as an independent, promising to slash the deficit and block the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Although Democrat Bill Clinton would emerge victorious, the Texans still managed to get 19% of the vote. Then there's George Wallace in 1968, the height of the civil rights movement. Wallace ran in opposition to much of that movement as a Southern pro-segregation Democrat rejected by the party. Running with the American Independent Party, Wallace managed to carry 5 Southern states as well as capture 14% of the national vote. Although Republican Richard Nixon would go on to become president, some say Wallace's campaign was toned down and replicated by future President Reagan. Now going back to 1912. When former President Theodore Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party in order to challenge his successor, William Howard Taft. After a disastrous Republican convention, Roosevelt supporters formed their own party in order to create a more progressive platform. Roosevelt would win 6 states and 27% of the popular vote, more than Taft's 23%, but would ultimately lose to Woodrow Wilson. He's the only third-party candidate to win more of the popular vote than a candidate from an established party. And finally, there's the Republican Party. Yep, that one, which was founded in 1854 by disaffected Whigs and anti-slavery activists. 6 years later, the nation would elect its first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. So you can tell anyone who wants to tell you how nonsensical third parties are to take it up with that guy.
Thank you, Anya. Dr. Jill Stein was the Green Party's 2012 candidate for the presidency. She's running again in this election, and with the defeat of Bernie Sanders, has been polling at about 7%. Thank you, Dr. Stein.
Great to be here, Chris.
So let's talk about this contest, the rise of, I think you would argue, a pretty vile and repugnant Republican candidate. Why does it make sense to step outside the system and support the Green Party?
Because the American people and the people all over the world are being thrown under the bus by this political system, which is actually being globalized, in fact. But just to focus on this country, a political system in which both parties are basically funded by and controlled by predatory banks, by fossil fuel giants, by war profiteers, by the health insurance industry, the usual suspects who are calling the shots from behind closed doors. I'm the only candidate in the race where actually people are clamoring for something else at unprecedented levels. People have rejected not only both of these parties, which are minority parties by actual polling, but they are running, their candidates are running at record levels, all-time highs for people disliking the Democratic and Republican.
They're the two most disliked candidates, since the last 10 election cycles or something?
I believe ever, since records have been kept, most disliked and most distrusted, at the same time that a majority of the public is demanding something else. And my campaign and the Green Party, we are the only candidates, we're the only party that does not take corporate money, we don't take money from lobbyists, and we do not have super PACs. So we actually have the liberty to address the crises that the American people are facing. And just to lay it out very quickly, we call for an emergency jobs program that will solve, at the same time, the emergency of climate change.
And we should argue what the last 15 months are every month being the hottest month on record since we began.
Exactly. And the most recent science, which is actually described by one of the senior scientists from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, what she reported verbally, so it hasn't been widely reported in the press yet, but what she reported to a national conference of insurance companies was that the latest report coming out of the Antarctic is what she described as an oh my God report, that the sea level is expected to rise as much as 9 feet as soon as 2050. That is a civilization-ending hit. So, you know, the climate is an issue. We can fix it. We call for a truly emergency mobilization that not only fixes the climate, but it also fixes the economic crisis. And by the way, it also makes wars for oil obsolete. So it's a win-win. But to, quickly summarize, at the same time, we call for canceling student debt. This is another crisis.
It's the largest personal debt.
Yes, and it's a generational crisis. It's really a human rights crisis. You have a generation that doesn't have jobs. They don't have a place to live. They cannot start families.
Their parents' basement.
Exactly. And the birth rate is plummeting. Talk about protecting reproductive rights. I heard that from a corporate member of the press yesterday. Well, aren't I hurting reproductive rights, by creating the possibility, just a whole series of ifs to try to corner me on being an enemy to women's reproductive rights. Well, I'd say it's harmful to everyone's reproductive rights if we don't have a planet that we can live on, and if young people are so held hostage, they can't have families at all.
Well, it's debt peonage as a form of social control. Every African American in this country has endured this since the end of slavery.
Exactly, which is another crisis that we call for truly fixing, not only to end police brutality, and there are ways that communities can control their police instead of having police control their communities, but we also call for getting down to the bottom of this crisis of racism, which causes racial violence not only in policing, but in education, in health, in jobs, in housing, in every sector of the economy.
Well, that's because in our internal colonies, poor people of color have been stripped of all rights and have an occupied police force that can do anything, including kill, with impunity.
Exactly. And some of the recent events have just demonstrated that.
But let me ask about Clinton.
Tragedy.
Do you look at Clinton and Trump as a difference in sort of kind of bedside manner?
I think that would be a good way to put it, because if you actually look at the track record, the terrible things that Donald Trump says, which are truly, reprehensible and horrific, those things have actually been done by Hillary Clinton. So
for example.
Well, for example, on immigrant xenophobia and hate-mongering, we've learned that Donald Trump and the Republicans are the party of hate and fear. But the Democrats, on the other hand, are the party of deportation, of detentions, and night raids. And who are they night raiding?
And mass incarceration.
Absolutely. And they are night raiding women and children who are fleeing the violence that Hillary Clinton herself gave the thumbs up to with this horrific corporate coup in Honduras. So, you know, U.S. policies, very much promoted by Hillary Clinton herself, are generating these refugees, which she then and the Democrats are criminalizing when they get here and sending them back. They are actually deporting immigrants. So Donald Trump is talking about it. Hillary Clinton has actually done it. So, you know, this is not something to feel safe and secure on, or finger on the nuclear button. Donald Trump talks very irresponsibly. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, wants to start an air war over Syria in creating a no-fly zone against a nuclear-armed country, that is Russia, against whom she has already been antagonizing the country by surrounding it with missiles bases and soldiers. How would we feel if Russian troops were amassing on the border of Mexico and Canada?
No, it's not the whole expansion of NATO, but that's basically for the arms manufacturers, so they can, it doesn't make any security sense to expand NATO beyond Germany.
And who is it that Hillary Clinton is accepting money from?
But isn't this the mistake to focus on the personalities? You know, we've undergone, I think, as John Ralston Saul says, a corporate coup d'etat. So the real centers of power, which Occupy understood, are in Wall Street, are in the military-industrial complex.
That's very true, but these candidates carry the water.
Well, they're the brand. They're the, or what Cornel West calls Obama, the black mascot for Wall Street.
The singer, the front person for the band, you know, and they're sort of the surrogate around which this discussion takes place. So I think the people stand for something, you know, and their moral character speaks volumes about the moral agenda that they carry. So I think it's fair to, you know, to include in this discussion Hillary's emails, because she actually deleted half of her emails.
Well, she didn't want
to
she did not want a FOIA request. She did not.
Exactly.
She did it on a private server so that no one would ever see her emails.
And the fact is, she deleted one half of her email saying they are private. I would ask, how leisurely is the job of being Secretary of State that half of your time can be spent discussing your yoga classes or your daughter's wedding or your grandchildren? You know, that's not what you do on company time, and we, the taxpayers, are not paying her to conduct half of her email volume on private matters while she in fact is providing contracts. Exactly. While she was providing lucrative contracts to war profiteers, in fact, and to countries with whom we are engaged in very dubious and illegal enterprises.
We'll return after a short break with Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein.
You're watching an RT America special report.
Man, it ain't about him. It's about you. It's about me. It's about everybody.
Basically, everything that you think you know about civil society has broken down.
There's always going to be somebody else one step ahead of the game.
We should not be in the business of normalizing violence.
We don't need people that think like this on our planet.
This is an incredibly tense situation.
About your sudden passing, I've only just learned. You wore yourself thin, taking your last wrong turn. Your act got up to you as we all knew it would. I'd tell you I'm sorry, if only I could. So I write these last words in hopes to put to rest these things that I never got off my chest. I remember when we first met, my life turned on each breath. But then my feelings started to change. You talked about war like it was a game. Still, some were fond of you, those that didn't like to question or argue. And I secretly promised to never be like you. It's said one does not leave a funeral the same as one enters. A mind gets consumed with death, but this one quite differs. I speak to you now because there were no other takers. To proclaim that mainstream media has met its maker.
Chris Hedges. Welcome back. Let's continue our conversation with Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. Let's talk about the Trump phenomena. And I think you would argue that Trump is not the phenomena, but is responding to a phenomena created by figures like the Clintons.
Exactly. You know, Donald Trump is the product of decades, really, of growing economic misery that's created this vulnerability, this fear, this sense of dread on behalf of the American worker and also the American middle class, largely the white worker and the white middle class, to whom adversity is somewhat new. And so they become very vulnerable to demagoguery, to this wishful, memory about how we can recreate a powerful America of the past. But what created this economic misery? There's not much question about that. This goes back specifically to Wall Street deregulation and the economic crash that disappeared 9 million jobs, that stole 5 million homes out from under homeowners, and to NAFTA, which basically allowed 1 million jobs and more to be sent overseas, and for wages to be pushed downward. So where did that come from? That was the Clintons, passed by Bill, but advocated for and celebrated by Hillary Clinton. So the bottom line is that it is neoliberalism, it is austerity that basically creates, this kind of neo-fascist movement, this right-wing extremism. Exactly. It's the same basic thing. So putting another Clinton in the White House, that's not the solution. That was the problem, and it's only going to fan the flames of right-wing extremism. As Bernie Sanders himself said, many times, the solution to this kind of crisis, and it's real pain that the Trump supporters are responding to, the solution is truly progressive and transformative, just economic, revolutionary policies, and that's what my campaign brings to the table. And I also just want to point out that this is not kind of pie in the sky that we can fix this. The real solution here is economic investments. It's job creation. It's not wish fulfillment about how Donald Trump is going to cut a better deal for us. Donald Trump leaves a wake of bankruptcies and lawsuits behind him from workers who've been cheated and jobs that have been sent overseas. So, Big Daddy is not the Big Daddy that we need. We are the ones we've been looking for. We call for real economic investments here in the form of a Green New Deal, like the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression, 20 million jobs and so on, that will also solve the climate crisis. So we can do this. We can grow the economy in a just and sustainable way. But then people say, well, but still, how are you going to get from here to there? And I want to point out that we have an incredibly powerful tool right now. That is the tragedy of student debt. Just happens to provide a real effective self-mobilizing force. There are 42 million young people and not so young people, people all the way up into Social Security now, whose Social Security is being deducted in order to pay their student loan debt. For decades this has been a problem, but it's gotten worse and cumulative. So there are 42 million locked into student debt. My campaign is the only one that will cancel that debt like we canceled the debt for the Wall Street crooks who crashed the economy. So if we bailed out the crooks, it's time to bail out their victims through the same tool of a quantitative easing. It doesn't cost taxpayers a thing. It expands the money supply, which is a great thing to do if you're actually increasing the productivity of the economy. This is the stimulus package of our dreams. But the point is, 42 million is a winning plurality of the vote. So just by getting the word out, especially to millennials, that they can come out, mobilize their friends, take over this election, we can actually win it to cancel student debt, make college free, and the rest of the agenda for justice that this generation has had the life experience to know must be enacted.
Well, and let's not forget to make institutions like Harvard, where we went to school, pay taxes.
How about that? Yes.
Let me ask about
and in fact, it will force them to lower their tuitions as well when all the public colleges have suddenly become free. You know, for them to remain competitive, they're going to have to bring their costs down.
Let's talk about a topic that Bernie Sanders did not want to touch, and that's the military-industrial complex, which I think the Green Party has done an admirable job of dealing with in terms of massive reductions of our military budget and an understanding that the military-industrial complex and those private defense contractors or the war machine are hollowing the country out from the inside. Let's talk about that.
Totally. Few people know what we pay for this catastrophic military, which shoots first and asks questions later. And in fact, what we have is a foreign policy, which is essentially a marketing strategy for selling weapons. And that's sort of what our decisions reflect. So we've had these wars for oil, which are, again, opportunities to sell weapons and also to commandeer other people's fossil fuel resources, which is basically what our military is doing. Why do we have 1,000 bases in over 100 countries around the world? This is not something that other countries do. If you add up all the other foreign bases of all the other countries, it comes to something like 30. We have 1,000 of them. Why are we doing that? Basically to safeguard our energy supplies and their routes of transportation, which, by the way, can no longer be justified. It's all obsolete when we have a Green New Deal, which will reach 100% wind, water, and sun, clean renewable energy entirely by 2030. So we can begin phasing down this network and stop stealing other people's oil right now. And for that, we spend $1 trillion a year, but on just 2 wars, Iraq and Afghanistan,
which we've lost
big time. We've spent $6 trillion, 6 trillion with a T, when you include all the healthcare expenses of our wounded veterans. Killed 1 million people in Iraq alone, not winning the hearts and minds of people in the Middle East, to say the least. And what do we have for it? Failed states, mass refugee migrations that are tearing apart Europe as well as the Middle East.
Propelling the right wing, these proto-fascist movements in Europe.
Exactly. And creating worse terrorist threats. Right. Because with each turn of the cycle of violence, it gets worse. How much have we paid? $6 trillion. What does that mean? $75,000 on average per American household for this disaster, which has been just an unmitigated catastrophe. So not only are we calling for demilitarizing our foreign policy so we could actually do something effective, but for bringing those dollars back into our economy here at home, which is how we create true security. If you just look at this $1 trillion a year that we're spending, if you cut it in half, we basically have the discretionary money we need right there to provide for free public higher education, ensure any health costs that aren't covered already just by switching to Medicare for all, which gets rid of the waste, so that actually takes care of itself. But, you know, essentially, we have the dollars at that point to do whatever we need, including working with other countries around the world, because we all share this fight against the major enemy, which is climate change. all of us are hurting bad from the impacts of climate change, and all of our economies are being devastated by military costs. No other country is spending as much as we are. We can cut by 50%, and we're still spending far more than them. But they are in crisis as well with their military expenditures. So we need to sit down like human beings here at a table and work collaboratively to address what is really the terminal and most threatening crisis for all of us, and that's climate change and its nuclear weapons. In fact, none other than Putin had proposed to, I believe it was Clinton, that we each bring our nuclear arsenals down to 1,000, and then we bring everybody together and we get rid of them entirely. So it's been us who's been the foot dragger here, who's been the obstacle to eliminating nuclear weapons.
I want to ask about Wall Street, the banks.
The banks.
Yes. What are we going to do about these criminal enterprises like Citibank and Wells Fargo and Goldman Sachs?
We're going to bring the rule of law back to Wall Street, you know. Talk about the rule of law and order that we've heard something about in a recent convention. You know, we need law and order on Wall Street, where all of the cops basically were retired, were taken off the beat by the White House administrations of the last, you know, decade or two. They took all the cops off the beat, all the FBI agents, all the other agents who are supposed to surveil Wall Street. Wall Street doesn't police itself.
Are we break the banks up?
Absolutely.
We nationalize banks?
Yes, all of the above. And in fact, this is not something that even has to go through Congress. There's a wonderful economist called Bill Black, who is a Wall Street whistleblower. He was also a regulator during the savings and loan crisis, so he knows how to regulate Wall Street. It's not so hard. What it takes is a president who actually supports regulating Wall Street.
Wall Street.
Wouldn't that be novel? Exactly. And so it could be done right now, and it doesn't have to go through Congress. Through the executive power over the agencies, the president can do what's needed, which is essentially to require so-called minimum capital requirements. Fancy words, but it means that we can downsize the banks right now based on their degree of risk, which is proportional to their size and to their reckless gambling. So they could be downsized right now. They could be compelled to downsize right now, even without having an act of Congress. But there are all kinds of things that Congress needs to do as well.
Including a public banking system.
A public banking system, and, you know, making the Fed a public institution rather than a private institution.
A money trough for big banks.
For private banks,
yeah.
Exactly. And the banks have only gotten bigger and more reckless since 2008, and we are only teetering more on an even steeper brink.
We're headed for another dislocation, perhaps on the same magnitude.
Yes, and perhaps even more.
And wait till they come back for more money.
That's right. And now they have whole new ways to get at us, including the so-called bail-in instead of the bail-out. And the bail-in, where they basically hold on to your money if your money happens to be not only in a bank, but in a in any sort of investment or pension fund that rests at night in the bank. Even that can be...
They seize it. That's what they've done in Italy.
Exactly.
Great.
That's right.
Thank you very much. You got my vote.
All right, thank you. You know, we can have an America and a world that works for all of us, and we have the power to do it.
We just got to stand up and do it.
Exactly.
That was Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. The battle before us is global. It is a battle being fought on a myriad of fronts, including in Greece, Egypt, Spain, Great Britain, France, and Venezuela. The ravages of climate change, the ruthless exploitation of international finance, and the evil of American imperialism and militarism are as present outside our borders as they are at home. Our real compatriots do not look like us. They speak in foreign tongues. They come from different cultures and faiths. They fight on the streets of Athens and Madrid and in Tahrir Square. It is only when we link arms, when we make common cause against the hydra-headed monster of global corporatism and American imperialism, that we will have any hope of victory. We will have to step for perhaps as long as a decade into the political wilderness. We will have to begin to build alternative parties and movements. If we fail to do so, we will ensure the establishment of an American fascism. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.